Thank you everyone for joining me today. This lecture is the first of a three-part series. The class is called Revelation Remix. What does this book tell us about the end of the world? I think that's the title, but you all may know it better if you have the material in front of you. Today we're going to talk about Revelation and Empire. And this is the first session, and after this, we meet once a month in May, June, and July. And this is part of your continuing education units. Some of you may not need the continuing education units, but may be just interested in this topic, and so please come join us. The next three sessions will also focus on the book of Revelation, but it will be Revelation with a particular theme. So May will be Revelation and women. June will be Revelation and climate change, and July will be Revelation and your projects, right? So that's pretty much what's going to happen. Today, I want to talk a little bit about Revelation against the empire, unmasking power and oppression. So if I can get the first slide. When it comes to the Roman Empire's influence, Adam Wynne writes that though Christianity was birthed under the power of empire, and every page of Christian history was written under its shadow, the Roman Empire has played a very insignificant role when it comes to New Testament scholarship. New Testament scholars rarely use the empire as a backdrop. And so, but as Wynne points out, Rome was not just a government, it was an empire. It controlled religion, economy, architecture, and daily life. So therefore, when we read New Testament texts, all of the New Testament texts, including the letters of Paul, it is very important to recognize that they are written under the Roman rule. And yet, for the longest time, scholars have treated the Roman Empire as part of a background noise. In fact, as John Dominic Crossan reminds us, Roman imperial theology was in fact the glue that held Roman civilization together. And therefore, it is important when we especially read Revelation, we read Revelation as a text that is written under the shadow of empire. The next slide, please. So why was empire overlooked? Western scholars often assumed that religion and politics should be separate, just like the church and state today. But those of you who are in the church know that it's not that easy. In the Roman world, this divide did not exist. And also, most of the scholars who wrote on Revelation came from places of privilege. Most of them were men, and most of them were from the European context. So therefore, they were not seeing these texts as texts that were written in subversive ways. And when you're on the top, it's hard to see the world from the bottom. Next slide, please. So therefore, there's a shift that starts to happen, especially when postmodern and postcolonial scholars come in and begin to read the New Testament texts. They began to recognize that early Christians were not just early Christians, and I'll say Christians in quotation because at this point there are no Christians yet, they're Jewish people, but these people are colonized and oppressed. And they begin to ask the question, if you are colonized and oppressed, how do you then respond to empire? And that changed in the past 30 years. Postmodern and postcolonial thinkers like Homi Bhabha and James C. Scott helped scholars see their own biases. Suddenly, New Testament authors were not privileged theologians, but people from contexts that were oppressed, that were speaking into the empire. And this began to raise the question, what if these texts were not submissive, but subversive? The next slide, please. So, Christian responses to empire are varied. You have responses where people are openly subversive. You also have responses where people are accommodative. They are sort of not sure where they are with the empire. They're resisting, but not quite as openly. So there's a complexity in the way these authors are responding to empire. Some will resist, some will accommodate, some will do both. The beauty is that the New Testament does not offer one set of answers. In fact, the way you look at it is that it offers us strategies, diverse set of strategies. It also tells us the reality that resistance sometimes may not always be the right answer. Sometimes accommodation, sometimes hybridity, sometimes implicitly being resistant. Next slide. So, one of the ways that resistance takes place in the ancient world is through coded and co-opted languages. As many of you know over here, the New Testament is written in what language? Koine Greek, right? And who was the one who spoke Greek and Latin during that time? It was the empire. So when you're writing in the language of the empire, how do you resist empire? You resist by taking the language of the empire and playing with it, coding it, co-opting it, and pushing back against the empire. Christians used Rome's own language against it. You know, words like the gospel, evangelion, Lord, Son of God, Savior, peace, justice, these were all words in which they were resisting empire. It was also a way to subtly challenge Caesar's authority. Early Christians also borrowed Rome's own language, and they used these language for Jesus. So you all of a sudden you start seeing, you know, when they're saying, Jesus, Son of God, guess who had that title? Caesar, right? And so then you take that title and you go and give it to someone who was crucified. Oh, there's a big thing. There's something happening there, right? So it is not subtle. It's bold. The next slide. Hidden transcripts. I think I missed a slide. Yeah, there we go. Hidden transcript. James C. Scott, and I use his work a lot. If any of you are interested, please do get his work. It's called Domination in the Arts of Resistance. James C. Scott calls this language hidden transcripts, it is transcripts that are publicly expressed, but only the people who are oppressed are understanding what is happening. Publicly, the oppressed may seem submissive, but in private, they're telling stories that challenge power, and Revelation is one of those books that is full of hidden transcripts, because it's not just full of monsters, judgment, and hope, it's also full of coded language. The Malay term for gossip and rumor, called kabar angin, news on the wind, captures the diffused quality of responsibility that makes such aggression possible. The character of gossip that distinguishes it from rumor is that gossip contains typically stories that are designated to ruin the reputation of some identifiable person or persons. If perpetrators remain anonymous, the victim is clearly specified. So think back to the Gospel of Mark, where the women go to the tomb and they run away, and there's a whole lot of thing about what was happening. Was he really risen or not? And it's often given, you'll see many New Testament scholars talk about it as gossip, right? And so if it is gossip, really think about, rather than dismissing the gossip, think about gossip as a subversive way in which this rumor or the story is taking hold within the community, the early Christian community. Most gossip is a discourse about social rules that have been violated. A person's reputation can be damaged by stories about his tight-fistedness, his insulting words, his cheating, or his clothing, only if the public among whom such tales have circulated have shared standards of generosity, polite speech, honesty, and appropriate dress. I just want to tell you a story. In India, we have the caste system, and there was this really rich family that that was belonged to an upper caste and had many lower caste people who worked in their fields. And many of them, the lower caste people, were not allowed to use the name of the upper caste person, right? So they always had to call them Mr. or Mistress or Lord or, master, that kind of word. And one day when the kids were walking through, the upper caste kids were walking through the field, they saw a lot of the lower caste people just shout out names of their moms and dads and grandparents, and they're wondering, who are they shouting at? And then they went close and saw that what the lower caste people had done was they had named all the cattle with the upper caste names. And so they would shout at them, and they would use their names when they were away from the house. So think about how resistance is always around us and how it's happening even in the small moments, right? Because resistance is about helping people, oppressed communities, recognize that they're alive and they have agency. The next slide. These are 2 coins, so I want you to look at these coins. One of them is Vespasian's between 69 and 79 AD. And on the other side, on this side, you see, is the image of Vespasian, holding a scepter, and there's a woman who's sitting there and crying, and that represents Judah, Israel, right? And this is during the time when Vespasian went in and captured the temple. And then these coins were created. And so now if you have to buy groceries, think about what that says about Jewish people. If you have to buy your groceries, if you have to exchange, you're using symbols of your defeat to feed yourself. So why would we not expect people to be not just hating the empire, but finding ways to co-opt the language and resist? So this is part of imperial theology, as John Dominic Crossan talks about. The next slide. So resistance through communities. The New Testament also models resistance through community life. When Paul tells people to honor the lowly, share meals without expecting payback, or challenges the paterfamilias model of power, he is also giving people a radically different society, one that undermines Rome's social control. The most powerful prediction of the destruction of Roman power is found in Revelation. But Revelation often goes beyond than simply predicting the destruction of Rome, and it vividly imagines what this describing of this destruction looks like. And in many cases, it's very problematic in the way it's describing Rome. Of course, it's widely recognized that Babylon is a coded reference to Rome, which, like Rome, had destroyed the Jewish temple. The next slide. I want to talk a little bit about accommodation. While you had resistance and open resistance happening, you also had people who were accommodating, and not everything was resistance. Some texts submit to Rome. Paul, or maybe even a later writer, says to obey the state in Romans 13. The writer of Ephesians tells wives to submit and slaves to obey. Are these texts capitulating, or are they mimicking? And can accommodation also be seen as resistance? The last slide. I want to introduce hybridity to you all. Hybridity is a concept that comes out in Homi Bhabha's work, The Location of Culture. It is a very dense text, but if you have it in you, please take a look at it. It's very, very helpful. Bhabha's idea of hybridity is helpful because he talks about how colonized people often imitate the empire, but not perfectly. In the book of Revelation, and if you read the way John of Patmos creates this empire of God, it eerily looks like a duplication of Rome. right? And the reason he does that is because he himself would be considered a hybrid subject, that in the midst of resisting Rome, he also mimics it. In the midst of mocking Rome, he also mimics Rome. They tweak, bend, and reinterpret. But what does this obedience look like? And could it actually be just obedience or accommodation, hybridity, or also subtle resistance? And then my final slide. I was supposed to show you a short video, but I don't have time for that. So it's a great video by Trevor Noah. Anybody seen him? It's wonderful. He talks about going to an Indian restaurant and ordering Indian food. I don't know if you'll have seen that clip. And there's an Indian guy who comes in and talks with an Irish accent, and it completely throws him off. And it's a great way to understand hybridity, that just because you look a certain way doesn't mean you're always from that certain place, right? And how hybridity allows you to belong to multiple contexts at the same time, and at the same time belong to neither of the contexts. And that's the beauty and the curse of hybridity. So what's the takeaway? The New Testament doesn't ignore empire. It's full of empire talk. But the responses vary. Some are defiant, some blend in, some imitate, some subvert. Understanding these responses will help us read the Bible not just as a spiritual book, the Bible as a political book as well. So that's my first lecture. Any questions before I move to the second one?
My question is, will these slides be available to us? I would like to actually move forward with this, and it would be nice to be able to have these in a month when we move to the next section.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you will have it. I will put it up on, I think this is getting recorded, right, Jim? Yes, it is getting recorded. So I'll put the recording up, and I will put the slides up, and I will also put all the people I referenced in the slide as well.
All right, outstanding. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Are you going to address the Lord's Prayer in the context of empire?
No, because we're talking about Revelation, but I could when I do the other sessions, of course, yes. Again, the reason I would not right now is because Revelation responds to empire very differently than the Gospels do. And that's very important to keep in mind, that the Gospels are not as antagonistic with empire as John of Patmos is, and so therefore you will see in the Gospels that they're not completely opposed to empire, but they're also not antagonistic towards empire the way John of Patmos is.
Thank you.
Yeah. Question? When was the book of Revelation written? It's all over the place. Some dated near the death of Nero, and having to do with the idea that Nero, because many people believe that Nero was not, would come back from the dead, and so they believe that the Antichrist is Nero, and so they would place it close to that. Many place it after the Gospels, and after Paul as well. Paul is much earlier than the Gospel, so probably around 110, 110 AD. But again, it's all over the place. Scholars don't have there's no consensus about it. Yeah, and the dating is all. The way they date it, do you all know how they date it? They look at the beast, right? And so, he says, and the first beast came, and it had a mark, and then, and so they think that John of Patmos, when he's talking about the beast, is actually talking about the emperors of Rome, and that's how they date that. Yeah. Good.